Today I'm going to tell you the story of a rancher who refused to bid on a black infant at an illegal slave auction. Joshua Hayes' moral stand in 1868 Texas cost him everything, but sparked an extraordinary response from an unexpected community. But what happened next will restore your faith in humanity. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening to this story from. The auction that shook a town. The oppressive August heat of 1868 hung over Millerville, Texas, like a heavy blanket, as rancher Joshua Hayes guided his chestnut mare down the dusty main street. At 43, Joshua was a weathered man, whose sun-lined face and calloused hands told the story of someone who had built his modest 1,000-acre spread from nothing through sheer determination and backbreaking work. Despite the Civil War ending 3 years earlier, Texas remained a place where old attitudes died hard and federal authorities struggled to take root. The Reconstruction period had brought new laws, but changing hearts proved far more difficult than changing legislation. Joshua had come to town reluctantly, drawn by troubling reports of a special auction that had the entire county buzzing with anticipation. What he discovered in the town square made his stomach turn with revulsion and sparked a rage that threatened to consume his better judgment. A makeshift wooden platform had been hastily erected near the courthouse steps, and arranged upon it were several African Americans, men, women, and children of varying ages. Despite slavery's legal abolition, illegal human trafficking continued to flourish in remote areas where federal authorities had limited reach and local sentiment remained unchanged. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out Silas Crawford, a notorious former slave trader who had supposedly retired after emancipation, but had clearly found creative ways to continue his profitable business. "We have some fine specimens today, all allegedly orphans or unclaimed individuals under special territorial emergency provisions." Joshua recognized the legal double-talk immediately. These were almost certainly freed slaves who had been kidnapped from their new lives or tricked into signing false labor contracts that essentially re-enslaved them under different names. Among the crowd of eager bidders, Joshua recognized several of his neighbors, men he had considered decent human beings until this moment, men who had shared meals at his table and whose families had attended the same church. The sight of their hungry faces as they examined human beings like livestock filled him with profound shame for his community and deep regret for ever considering these people friends. Now, this little one here would make a fine house servant, Crawford continued with practiced showmanship, gesturing toward a black child who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. "Smart-looking boy? Healthy? Bidding starts at $50. The toddler clung desperately to the worn cotton skirts of a young woman who was clearly his mother, though Crawford was deliberately presenting them as separate lots to maximize his profit. The woman's dark eyes held the kind of desperate, soul-deep terror that Joshua recognized from his worst memories of the war. "60, called a voice. 75, shouted another. Joshua's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists as the bidding continued, each call driving the price higher while driving his faith in humanity lower. He was one man against a crowd of 50 or more, but every fiber of his being screamed against the abomination he was witnessing. "Do I hear 80? Crawford asked with the enthusiasm of a carnival barker. $80, came the immediate response. Joshua looked at the terrified child, barely more than a baby, and saw innocence about to be destroyed by greed and hatred. The boy didn't understand what was happening, but he sensed the danger and malevolence surrounding him like a dark cloud. "Going once for $80, Crawford announced with theatrical flair, clearly enjoying his moment of power over human lives. Joshua made a life-changing decision. "This auction is illegal," he shouted. "These people are free citizens under federal law." Shocked silence fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to Joshua with collective hostility. "Joshua Hayes," Crawford said mockingly, "are you bidding on this boy?" "I'm not bidding on any human being," Joshua replied loudly, And neither should any of you. This is kidnapping and human trafficking. These are legal proceedings under territorial provisions, Crawford said smoothly. These individuals need employment arrangements. Employment arrangements that involve selling children, Joshua demanded. Men in the crowd moved toward Joshua threateningly. Mayor Thompson called out, "You're disrupting legal proceedings. Participate or leave." Joshua looked around at faces he'd known for years, neighbors who now stared with anger and contempt. "I'll leave," Joshua said, "but not before saying what needs saying." He addressed the entire crowd with the authority of a former military officer. "Look at yourselves. That's a baby you're bidding on, a child who should be playing, not being sold like cattle." "He's just property," someone called out. "He's a human being," Joshua replied firmly. "The war is over. Slavery is done. Anyone participating in this is no better than a criminal." The crowd grew uglier. Hands moved toward weapons. "You got something against honest profit, Hayes?" Crawford asked hostilely. "I've got something against treating children like property," Joshua replied. "Then bid on him yourself," Crawford snarled. "Put your money where your mouth is." The challenge hung in the air. Every eye focused on Joshua. His modest ranch operated on thin margins. Spending money unnecessarily could mean disaster. But the image of that baby being torn from his mother was unbearable. "No," Joshua said quietly but clearly. "I won't bid because I won't legitimize this obscenity by participating." The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Someone threw fruit that hit Joshua's shoulder. Others pushed closer with hostile intent. "You self-righteous bastard!" Crawford screamed. "Who are you to judge us?" "Someone who fought to preserve the Union," Joshua replied, backing toward his horse. "I didn't fight so we could continue buying human beings after we won." As Joshua mounted his horse, he looked once more at the child. Their eyes met briefly, and Joshua saw a plea for help from someone too young to understand what help meant. "This isn't over, Hayes," Crawford shouted. "You'll regret this." Joshua knew Crawford was probably right. He had made enemies of half the county. But as he rode home under the blazing sun, Joshua Hayes knew he had done the right thing. Perhaps the only truly right thing since the war ended. The price of standing alone. 3 days after the auction, Joshua discovered the true cost of his moral stand when he rode into town for essential supplies. The normally bustling main street seemed to part before him like the Red Sea, but not out of respect, out of contempt and coordinated hostility. At Morrison's general store, Pete Morrison met him at the entrance with crossed arms and a cold stare that could have frozen whiskey in July. "We're not serving you anymore, Hayes," Pete announced loudly enough for half the street to hear. "Your money's no good here." "Since when?" Joshua asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Since you decided to side with niggers over your own neighbors," Pete replied with venom. "Word around town is you're an abolitionist troublemaker, and we don't need your kind poisoning our community." Joshua felt the weight of isolation settling around him like a noose. Without access to supplies, ammunition, tools, and medicine, his ranch would slowly strangle. In frontier Texas, community support wasn't just helpful, it was absolutely essential for survival. "I stood up for what's right," Joshua said quietly, maintaining his dignity despite the public humiliation. "You stood up for what's wrong and against your own people," Pete shot back. "Now you can live with the consequences of your choices." As Joshua rode slowly down Main Street, he noticed curtains twitching in windows and conversations stopping abruptly when people spotted him. Children who had once waved enthusiastically now stared with the inherited hatred of their parents. The social fabric that had connected him to his community was unraveling thread by thread. At the Cattleman's Bank, the situation deteriorated further. President Howard Clemens, a man Joshua had considered a friend for 8 years, refused to see him personally. Instead, young Billy Thompson, the nervous clerk, delivered a message that hit like a physical blow. "Mr. Clemens says your loan payment is due early," Billy stammered, unable to meet Joshua's eyes. "Full amount by the end of this week." "That's not what we agreed when I signed the papers," Joshua protested. "I've got 2 more months according to our contract." "Terms have been Reviewed, Billy replied miserably. I'm real sorry, Mr. Hayes, but that's what Mr. Clemens instructed me to tell you. Joshua understood the game immediately. They were attempting to force him into bankruptcy, to drive him completely out of the county. His ranch was profitable, but operated on thin margins typical of small operations. An unexpected early loan payment would cripple him financially and possibly cost him everything he'd worked to build. Tell Clemens I'll find the money, Joshua said with more confidence than he felt. The long ride home gave Joshua ample time to contemplate his impossible situation. He could apologize publicly, denounce his actions at the auction, and probably restore his standing in the community. It would be the practical choice, the smart choice for a man trying to survive in increasingly hostile territory. But every time he considered backing down, Joshua saw that terrified child's face and knew he couldn't betray his principles for the sake of convenience or financial security. That evening, as Joshua sat on his porch, contemplating his dwindling options and watching the sun set over his threatened land, he heard the distinctive sound of multiple horses approaching from the east. 2 riders emerged from the gathering twilight, and Joshua's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle leaning against his chair. To his surprise, the visitors were Samuel Washington, a freed slave who worked various odd jobs around the county, and his teenage son, Marcus. Both men dismounted respectfully and approached with their hats in their hands. "Mr. Hayes," Samuel said formally, "might we have a word with you, sir?" "Of course," Joshua replied, gesturing toward the other chairs on his porch. "What brings you out here?" "We heard about what happened in town," Samuel explained carefully. "About how you spoke up at that auction. Word travels fast," Joshua observed. "Faster in our community than yours, I expect," Samuel said with a slight smile. "We wanted to thank you for what you did. Took real courage to stand up like that." "We didn't do enough," Joshua said bitterly. "That child and his mother are still in chains because I wasn't willing to participate in their degradation." "You did more than most would," Marcus spoke up for the first time. "And we heard about your troubles in town today?" Joshua raised an eyebrow. "News really does travel fast." "Mr. Hayes," Samuel said seriously, "we know you're facing hard times because you stood up for what's right. We'd like to help if you'll let us." "I appreciate the offer," Joshua replied, "but I don't see how—" "You might be surprised," Samuel interrupted gently. "There are more folks grateful for what you did than you might think, and some of us have skills and resources you might find useful." As if to prove his point, more riders appeared in the distance, their silhouettes visible against the darkening sky. "Who's that?" Joshua asked. Samuel smiled. "Word travels fast, like I said, and kindness, Mr. Hayes, has a way of coming back to a man when he needs it most." An unexpected alliance. As the evening shadows lengthened across Joshua's ranch, more riders continued to arrive until nearly 20 people had gathered in his front yard. Men, women, and even some children dismounted from horses, mules, and wagons, all of them freed slaves or their descendants who had heard about Joshua's stand at the auction. "Mr. Hayes," Samuel Washington said, gesturing toward the assembled group, "I'd like you to meet some folks who've been talking about what happened in town." An elderly woman stepped forward, her gray hair neatly braided and her weathered hands clasped respectfully in front of her worn but clean dress. "I'm Mama Ruth," she said with dignity that commanded immediate respect. "I raised 7 children in bondage and lived to see them all freed. What you did for that baby and his mama, that took the kind of courage most folks don't possess." Joshua felt overwhelmed by the attention and praise. "I didn't do anything special, just couldn't stomach watching a child being sold like livestock. That's exactly what made it special," said a tall, powerfully built man who introduced himself as Benjamin Clark. "Most white folks in this county would have either participated in the bidding or walked away pretending they didn't see nothing. You stood up and called it what it was, evil. And now you're paying the price for doing right," added a woman named Sarah Jenkins, whose 3 young children peered shyly from behind her skirts. "We heard about the store refusing your business, the bank calling in your loan early." Joshua nodded grimly. Word does travel fast around here. Faster than you might think, Samuel said with a knowing look. See, most of the freed folks in this county work for white families in one capacity or another. We hear things, conversations people think we're not listening to, plans they make assuming we're not smart enough to understand. What kind of plans? Joshua asked, though he suspected he already knew. The kind designed to drive you completely out of the county, Benjamin replied bluntly. Crawford and his friends are planning to make sure no business in 3 counties will deal with you. They figure if they can't change your mind, they'll change your address. The weight of his situation hit Joshua like a physical blow. He had known his stand would have consequences, but the scope of the organized retaliation surprised him. So what do you propose I do about it? Joshua asked. Mama Ruth stepped forward again. We propose you let us help you survive this storm, and in return you help us with something we need. What would that be? Safe passage, Samuel explained. See, that auction the other day wasn't the first of its kind, and it won't be the last. Crawford and men like him are still operating what amounts to a slave trade, just using different legal language to justify it. We need someone with standing in the white community who's willing to help us get word to federal authorities when these things happen, Benjamin added. Someone who can't be dismissed as easily as we can. Joshua considered this proposal carefully. What they were asking would essentially make him part of an underground network working against illegal slavery operations. Dangerous work that could result in far worse consequences than social ostracism. You're asking me to become part of a resistance movement, Joshua said. We're asking you to continue being who you already showed yourself to be, Mama Ruth corrected gently. A man who won't stand by while children are sold into bondage. And in return, Samuel said, you get access to a network of skilled workers, craftsmen, farmers, and laborers who don't care what the white folks in town think about your politics. We've got blacksmiths, carpenters, seamstresses, cooks, and field hands who'd be proud to do business with a man of principle. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward with a cloth bag in her hands. I brought you some preserves and fresh bread. Heard tell you haven't been eating too well since the store stopped serving you. A young man named Thomas Washington, Samuel's nephew, spoke up. I'm handy with horses, Mr. Hayes. That chestnut mare of yours has been favoring her left front hoof. I could take a look at it if you'd like. And I've got connections with suppliers in Austin and San Antonio, Benjamin added. Folks who'd be happy to sell you anything you need, probably at better prices than you were paying Morrison. Joshua looked around at the faces gathered in his yard, people who had every reason to mistrust white men, but who were offering friendship and support to someone they barely knew, simply because he had stood up for what was right. Why? Joshua asked quietly. Why risk yourselves to help me? You don't know me, don't owe me anything. Because what you did gives us hope, Mama Ruth replied simply. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this country can become what it claims to be, a place where all people are truly free and equal. And because, Samuel added with a slight grin, we believe in helping our friends. Question is, Mr. Hayes, are you willing to be our friend? Joshua looked at the assembled group, former slaves who had endured horrors he could barely imagine, yet who maintained dignity, hope, and generosity of spirit that shamed most of the white folks he knew. I'd be honored, Joshua said sincerely. Then we've got work to do, Benjamin declared. First thing tomorrow, we start fixing this place up and making sure you've got everything you need to weather whatever storm Crawford and his friends try to bring. As the group began to disperse for the night, several families setting up temporary camps near Joshua's barn, Mama Ruth approached him one final time. Mr. Hayes, I want you to know something. That baby you spoke up for at the auction? His name is Freedom Washington, Samuel's youngest grandson, and thanks to what you did, word has gotten out about Crawford's operation. Federal marshals are already asking questions. Joshua felt a surge of hope he hadn't experienced in days. You mean? I mean, your sacrifice may have saved more lives than just one, Mama Ruth said softly. Sometimes doing right doesn't feel like it makes a difference, but it always does. Always. As Joshua settled into bed that night, Listening to the quiet sounds of families camping peacefully on his land, he realized his life had taken a turn he never could have anticipated. He had lost his place in white society, but he had gained something potentially more valuable, a community built on shared principles rather than shared prejudices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since the auction, Joshua Hayes felt like he had allies in the fight ahead. 50 souls at the gate. Joshua awoke the next morning to sounds he hadn't heard on his ranch in years. The voices of children playing, the laughter of women preparing breakfast, and the purposeful conversations of men organizing work. As he stepped onto his porch, he was amazed to see his property transformed into a bustling community. Samuel Washington approached with a steaming cup of coffee and a smile that seemed to light up the dawn. "Morning, Mr. Hayes. Hope you slept well, because we've got a big day ahead of us." "This is incredible," Joshua said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I count at least 30 people here." 47, actually," Samuel corrected with pride. Word spread through the night, and more families arrived before sunrise. Everyone wanted to be part of this. Part of what exactly? "Part of showing this county what real community looks like," Benjamin Clark said, joining their conversation. "When good people work together, they can accomplish miracles." As if to prove his point, Joshua watched as organized teams spread out across his property with the efficiency of a military operation. A group of men were already repairing his barn roof, their hammers ringing in perfect rhythm. Women were tending to his vegetable garden, which had been neglected during his recent troubles. Children were feeding his livestock with the careful attention that spoke of farm-raised experience. "I can't possibly repay all this work," Joshua protested. "Who asked you to?" Mama Ruth said, appearing beside him with a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. "Sometimes people help because it's right, not because they expect payment." Thomas Washington led Joshua's mare over, the horse moving without the slight limp that had been bothering her for weeks. "That shoe just needed adjusting," Thomas explained. "She'll be good as new now." Throughout the morning, Joshua watched in amazement as his struggling ranch was systematically restored and improved. Fences were repaired and reinforced. Buildings were cleaned and weatherproofed. Tools were sharpened and organized. His well was cleaned and the pump mechanism repaired. "Mr. Hayes," called a woman named Elizabeth Freeman, "we've organized your supply situation. My brother runs a freight business out of Austin, and he's willing to bring you anything you need at fair prices." "My cousin works for a bank in San Antonio," added a man named James Butler. "If you need to refinance that loan on better terms, he can help arrange it." Joshua felt overwhelmed by the generosity and efficiency of these people who had every reason to be suspicious of white men, but had chosen to trust and help him instead. Around midday, a commotion near the ranch gate drew everyone's attention. A large group of riders was approaching, white men, at least 20 of them, led by Silas Crawford himself. "Trouble coming," Benjamin said quietly, moving protectively closer to Joshua. "Everyone stay calm," Joshua advised, though his own hand moved instinctively toward his rifle. "Let me handle this." Crawford and his men rode up to the gate, but stopped there, clearly surprised by the number of African Americans present and the organized nature of their activities. "Well, well," Crawford called out loudly, "looks like Hayes has found himself some new friends. Question is, are they here legally?" "They're here as my invited guests," Joshua replied firmly, stepping forward to meet the threat. "Working on my land with my permission, as free Americans have every right to do." "Free Americans," Crawford sneered. "That's a matter of interpretation in these parts." Samuel Washington stepped up beside Joshua, followed by Benjamin Clark and several other men. They didn't carry weapons openly, but their presence was unmistakably protective. "Is there something you need, Crawford?" Joshua asked. "Just checking on the welfare of these people," Crawford said with false concern, "making sure they're not being exploited or mistreated." Mama Ruth walked forward with the dignity of a queen, her aged hands clasped peacefully in front of her. "I'm quite capable of speaking for myself, thank you. We're here because we choose to be, helping a good man who stood up for what's right." A good man? Crawford laughed harshly. Hayes has turned his back on his own people, sided with niggers against his neighbors. That makes him a traitor in my book. That makes him a Christian in mine, Mama Ruth replied calmly. Jesus said to help the oppressed and defend the innocent. Mr. Hayes did exactly that. Crawford's face reddened with anger. You people need to understand your place. Things may have changed legally, but this is still Texas, and we still know how to deal with troublemakers. Is that a threat? Joshua asked, his voice carrying the steel that had once commanded troops in battle. Take it however you want, Crawford replied. But I'm warning you, this little social experiment of yours is going to end badly. For all of you. Benjamin stepped forward, his impressive physical presence making Crawford's horse sidestep nervously. Mr. Crawford, we're not looking for trouble. We're just helping a neighbor. But if trouble comes looking for us, it'll find us ready. The tension stretched tight as a wire for several long moments. Crawford clearly hadn't expected to find such organization and determination among the African-American families. And Joshua could see uncertainty creeping into the eyes of his followers. This isn't over, Crawford finally said, wheeling his horse around. Mark my words, this isn't over. As the group of hostile riders departed, the workers gradually returned to their tasks, but the atmosphere had changed. Everyone understood that their peaceful cooperation had painted targets on all their backs. I'm sorry, Joshua said to the assembled group. I never wanted to bring danger to your families. Danger was already here, Samuel replied philosophically. At least now we're facing it together, with someone who's proven he'll stand with us when it matters. That evening, as the work crews prepared to return to their homes, Joshua stood before the entire group, feeling humbled by their sacrifice and courage. I want to thank all of you, he began, his voice thick with emotion. You came here to help a stranger, and you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, hope. You gave us something too, Mama Ruth replied. You showed us that not all white folks see us as less than human. That means more than you know. Indeed, as families began departing in the gathering twilight, they left behind more than just a restored ranch. They had created a model of what American society could become, people of different backgrounds working together based on shared values rather than shared prejudices. The next morning, Joshua awoke to find 50 people standing silently at his gate, not working this time, not speaking, just standing in peaceful witness. Among them were the families who had helped him the day before, but also others, new faces, people who had traveled from far away just to be present. Samuel explained when Joshua approached. Word has spread about what happened yesterday, about Crawford's threats, about what we're trying to build here. These folks came to show that intimidation won't work. Joshua looked at the quiet dignity of the assembled crowd and felt his throat tighten with emotion. 50 people who had risked everything just to stand with him in the face of hatred and violence. This is what freedom looks like, Mama Ruth said softly, joining them at the gate. Not just the absence of chains, but the presence of people willing to stand together for what's right. Bitas, as the sun rose higher, illuminating the faces of 50 souls united in peaceful resistance, Joshua Hayes understood that his refusal to bid on a child had set in motion something far greater than he could have imagined. He had helped plant seeds of a different kind of America, one where character mattered more than color, where courage was more valuable than conformity. The fight ahead would be long and difficult, but looking at the determined faces surrounding him, Joshua knew they would not face it alone.